Shabbat Shalom. What is so challenging about the situation in Ukraine is that here was a normal country where life continued on not so differently from the way we experienced life or we know. In the space of days and weeks, just 1 month, millions have fled, leaving behind their possessions, their neighborhoods, their jobs, their lives, everything that they know. And now their homes lie in rubble. The whole country facing destruction, infrastructure in ruins, even reports of celebrities also dying in the violence, theaters gone, iconic cultural buildings. And those left behind are in public buildings and basements, babies born in bomb shelters. And I heard this story, or I was contacted a few weeks ago by a local couple here in Chicago who had a surrogate birth in Ukraine. Ukraine is the capital of surrogate births, and their baby was born a few days before the invasion. And so there was no way to get to it, and they contacted me because of my links to Israel, hoping I had a way to get their twins out of the basement in Kyiv where they were spending their days. This is it, life and death. And even for us, from afar, we're wondering, where will this all lead us? One day we're in a world with issues, but issues that we know are familiar to us, and then all changes. And where does it all leave us? How do we find ourselves in these changes and witnessing suffering and war and the perplexing reversals and the cycles, everything that we see through the course of our lives? In our parsha this morning, we read of tsarat, right? This strange disease, a strange skin disease that afflicted the ancients. And it perplexed them so much that they devoted all of this part of the Torah to it, 2 parshiyot, instructing the priests how to play their part, what to do to stop the spread of the disease, exams, quarantine. And the disease caused them to become impure. That was the core of the Jewish element of what happened. And they could only rejoin the community once they were pure. And again, once the priests had fulfilled all the different commandments and sacrifices and rituals, the final exam. But in the end, this is really what our parsha about, these twin poles of the existence of the ancient Israelites, purity and impurity, tumah and tahara. And that affected everything in their lives. They saw everything through the lens of what was pure and what was impure. And they were constantly trying to navigate between those states. And when they were impure, they were trying to contain it and box it in and not spread it and become pure again. And everything they did in their foods and their bodily functions and the places where they were, the people they were close to. And this is how our parsha begins, with this contemplation of purity and impurity. And it tells us when a person passes away, they became impure, or there was the impurity of death around them. And those loved ones around them had to deal with that impurity of death. They had to clear it away. We can understand that. We understand what it means when one of our loved ones passes away and we feel there's something wrong in the universe. We feel some kind of impurity. It leaves us feeling a certain way. The emotions it evoked within us, the thoughts it creates in our mind as we grapple with that loss. And we know that there is a process back to wholeness, call it purity, back to feeling right within ourselves. And our tradition, as we know, is wise in this regard. It offers us rituals and a whole way of returning to feeling whole within. And we each do it in our own way, in our own time. And witnessing death also, even when it's not only our loved ones, also gives us that sense of something wrong in the world, of impurity. When we awaken to death in the world and the brokenness of our world and what keeps happening in our planet, then we can also understand that need to return to purity. For the world, certainly, for our sake, too. And yet the great question of our parsha, purity and impurity isn't quite as simple as we think it is. Because the Tazria, the name of our parsha, the woman who gives birth, She gives birth to life, but yet she is also impure. New life is impure. And then, as we read last week in the Maftir, when they burnt the red heifer and its ashes, which were the most powerful purity producing agent of the ancient world, that made even the impurity of death back pure, that those priests who burned the red heifer became impure themselves. It's like a whole system that's created between those two poles, between life and death, purity and impurity. And perhaps it was about those places in life that confound us. We're unable to understand and to find order with what is occurring all around us. When we look to the heavens and say, well, what was this all about? What do we do when we see death all around us? When life doesn't make sense to us anymore? One of the great books of the Holocaust, Man in Search of Meaning, Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and a neurologist before World War II, but then he became for most of the whole war, an inmate in one of the concentration camps, and he describes his experiences and how out of the horror that he witnessed and the unpredictability and the possibility any day that this could be the last day for any of the inmates, whether they were sent to the gas chambers or to back-breaking labor that would finish them off, that the defining insight he had was that what kept the prisoner surviving emotionally and spiritually and physically was when they were able to find meaning within the day-to-day life that they were experiencing. And so he built a whole system of psychology around it, became very influential in its own way. And it was saying that our search in this life is not about pleasure, as Freud said. It's not about social acceptance, as Adler said, but it's about meaning. And as I was reading this book for our book club, men's book club last month, there was one passage that made me think about this part of the Torah and this purity and impurity in the space, how they come together, life and death. And it was about one of the inmates that Viktor Frankl met during his time in the concentration camps, that she was going through all the horrors. She found out that she was going to soon have to die, that it had been decided. And he went to her and started talking to her, and he found that astoundingly, she was grateful for what was happening to her. And her fear, she said her fear had dissolved. And she said that in her formal life, she felt she had been spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. And she pointed to a tree and she said, this tree here is my only friend in my loneliness. And I often talk to this tree. And startled, Frankl thought, well, she's losing her mind. She must be delirious. And so he hesitantly asked her, well, does the tree answer you back? And she said, yes. He said, well, what does it say? And she replies, it says to me, I am here, I am here. I am life, life eternal. It may be purity and impurity, or how the ancients brought meaning to those parts of life that they could find no meaning in. Perhaps they're tools given to us by the divine, by God, to try and understand and to try and touch places that transcend our human ability to understand and to comprehend the vast world around us. In their case, the diseases that ravished them and they couldn't understand why they were happening. The very mystery of life and death, the movements of between wholeness and brokenness that we all experience, and all in the world that we just cannot control. But yet they were saving, even within all of that, there's meaning. In the midst of all of it, flourishing and blossoming, calling out to us if we can hear it. We have more understanding than the ancients did of the physical nature of the world, what was mysterious to them. But truly the question is not that different. What do we do when we are confronted with death? Of others, of the people we love, our very own. With the incredible nature of life, the very beauty of it. The couple unable to have children, but who find a surrogate in Ukraine and are about to be able to realize the miracle and now what? And the broken nature of life. And what do we find there? In the contemplation of that moment of life and death, of purity and impurity, that great barrier between all of it, perhaps we find a space. Then the end is not so different one from the other, a kind of meaning, a truth that transcends both of them. We find the eternal life that's behind all of creation. We find our deepest humanity. We find fulfillment and knowledge, wisdom and being, joy and sadness, and a deep gratitude. Shabbat Shalom.